Hi everyone. So I'm going to do my class here. I'm not currently teaching an English class. I'm going to have to do this where I'm staying, which is in India, and it's a little bit noisy here sometimes, so bear with me if you hear some crunches and crashes in the background. And you can just imagine that there's a whiteboard behind me and that we're in a classroom. Okay, so I'll start with the warm-up and objective discussion, pretending I'm in a real classroom. Welcome everybody, thanks for coming. Have a seat. So how was your weekend? You do anything interesting? And you have a chance to practice a bit of English? Yeah, went to a movie? Yeah, that's good. You can take notes in the movie and about words that you didn't understand, talk with people afterward, discuss it, right? Always look for opportunities to practice. So, do any of you have a hard time understanding native English speakers when they're having conversations with each other? Anybody? Yeah, definitely. And the reason for this is that when two native speakers talk together, they speak generally more quickly than non-native speakers. They use contractions. They assume that the other person has some information, cultural information, inside jokes, different kinds of things. So it can be very hard to follow. If someone's giving just a presentation, like if somebody's giving a lecture, then we may find that easier to follow because they're assuming that you don't know so much and they won't use so many contractions. They generally won't speak so quickly. They'll speak more clearly. It's a presentation, something more formal. But when two native speakers are talking with each other, especially if the people know each other well, it can be quite difficult to understand, isn't it? I think it's really one of the most challenging parts of learning a language is understanding native speakers speaking with each other. So what we're going to do today is we're going to listen to an interview. Now, an interview is interesting because it is a conversation between two native speakers, generally. In this case it is. But it's a bit more formal than a regular conversation. The person doing the interview is asking questions that they don't know, that the audience doesn't know. Often the person doing the interviewing and the person being interviewed have not met each other before. They don't know each other. So we won't be missing out on some experience that they have had together. So I see this as a kind of practice. It's a little easier than hearing a regular conversation, but it's more difficult than hearing something like a lecture. So it's a midway point between hearing a lecture and hearing a regular conversation between two native English speakers. Now, the interview that we're going to listen to is from a podcast, an online show, an online radio show, from a site called Pencil Kings, which is a drawing site. So they have this podcast where the founder of the site, he interviews different artists. So in this case, he's interviewed someone called Will Terrell, who is a comic book artist. And it's a very interesting interview, also from the point of view of creativity, because Will Terrell, he talks about the process of creativity, about how to get one's creativity flowing, how to encourage other people to be creative, like this. It's a very interesting podcast, actually. So we're going to listen to this, and I'll ask you to pick out specific information, that I'll tell you ahead of time, and also to discuss afterwards, to discuss your thoughts about the podcast. So when you're listening to this, I have some questions that I'll write on the board here, and as you're listening, I'd like you to find the answers to those questions. So I'll write a number of questions on the board about. And here's some more questions. How did Will feel about these sketch groups? What's the downside of getting together to drink and draw? Why do people like sketching groups more than formal classes? Why does he sometimes prefer sketching groups? So these are some questions that I have for you. So first you go through and see if you can find the answers to those questions. We can listen to this several times. And I'll give this example. The first question, how did Will Terrell become a comic book artist? He grew up thinking he'd be a comic book writer, but found it really hard to find artists to draw his stories, so he became an artist himself. He found this to be a lot more work than he expected. So that's the answer to the first question. And then I'll make a question, what makes a good sketch group? So now I'd like you to write down, if you haven't already done so, the answers to the questions on the board on a piece of paper, and we'll share those in the class soon. And also to write some questions of your own about the podcast. And then later on, we'll also have a chance to discuss about the subject matter of the podcast, about creativity. So Will Terrell, he said that everybody's creative. I also think that, and people express it in different ways. You can discuss how you feel about that, whether you agree or disagree, what your opinion is. But for now, you can write the answers to the questions I've given on your piece of paper and come up with some questions of your own. Okay.